Hey everybody, Mary Rose here. Welcome to the live stream. It's 1 p.m. on Wednesday. I'm so glad to be here with you today. Now, today we're going to talk about pressure. We're going to talk about stress. We're going to talk about some tough stuff. So buckle in. We're going to talk about humans under pressure. We're going to talk about real humans under pressure, and we're going to talk about fictional humans under pressure. We're going to start with a key question. How does the main character of your story react to pressure? Do they fight back? Do they run away from conflict and confrontation? Do they freeze up like a deer in the headlights? Or do they abandon their goals completely? Now, the four strategies I just described are psychological categories that show how humans react to stress. And you may have heard them described with these words: fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. That's what we're going to talk about today. These are patterns of response to stress. Now, why is this relevant? Because our job as storytellers is to put our main characters under pressure. That is the very essence of story structure. So I think this is a pretty interesting topic and well worth investigating, and I hope you agree. I want to offer also a bit of a tip for those of you who might struggle with what we often call the passive hero problem. If you find that you have difficulty writing a hero who is actively moving your story forward, if you find that you struggle sometimes to put sufficient conflict in your scenes, this examination of how humans react to pressure, conflict, and stress, I think, is going to be especially valuable. So I hope you will stick around. Before we get in, I would just want to introduce myself and say hi to all the folks that are here live. I'm Mary Rosewood. I am an author. I'm best known for writing middle grade fiction. My most recent book is called Alice's Farmer Rabbit's Tale. It was published by Macmillan, and I'm also known for the Incorrigible Children of Ashton Place series, which is a really fun 6-book middle grade series published by HarperCollins. I've actually published 14 books with big 5 publishers. So that's just a way of saying I've been doing this for a long time. And I'm very happy to step into the role of mentor to writers at this stage of my career. I'm still actively writing. And, one of the great things about being a writer is that it's a career that can go on for as long as you want it to go on. And I hope mine goes on for a long time. But I'm also the founder of Path of the Storyteller. And I want to tell you a little bit about that. It is my own platform for teaching and mentoring writers, and it's where I can offer courses and coaching, and it's a really wonderful community. It's a group that I'm really, really proud of. We've got some wonderful Path of the Storyteller students and alumni here live already, I can see, and they're just doing fantastic work. I'm so proud of them. If you would like to learn a little bit more about the kind of work we do at Path of the Storyteller, here's a fun way to get started. I'm just going to add a little instruction here. There's a download that you can get at the Path of the Storyteller website that's a lot of fun. It is a collection of writing prompts that I wrote myself that are based on story structure. There are 30 writing prompts in the collection. And if you do them in order, it's going to walk you through story structure from the beginning through the middle to the end. So not only will you end up with lots of fun writing prompts and hopefully lots of fun writing, but you will get a sense, a little crash course, if you will, in how story structure works to give stories bones, to give them a shape, to take not only your main character, but your reader on a journey of transformation that's really satisfying. And that's kind of the hallmark of a well-told story. So go check out the free download. I've also posted a link below in the description to this video, so you can just click on that. All right, gang. Oh, look who's here. Let me just say a quick hello. Hillary, so delighted to see you here live. Constanza, lovely to see you. Nancy, I'm very pleased that you're here. And Anne is here. And Anne is giving a little endorsement. I'm going to share this, Anne, since I just mentioned it. Anne has been going through the 30-day writing prompts, and she says they are so helpful for keeping me on track with a plan and a personal deadline. Loving it. I am so delighted, Anne. It's so funny. Every time we sit down to write a new story, we've got to start at the beginning again. And so the need to think in story structure, it's not something that we do once and then, oh, we did it already. We're always grappling with it. So let's dive into this content today. I think it's a bit interesting. It's also a little complicated for me, so I'm going to be looking at my notes. You have to forgive me for glancing to the side occasionally. So I want to start by making a statement. You can fight with me if you like. This is a live stream. If you're here live, you can leave comments and let me know what you're thinking. But here's the assertion that I want to make to get us going. The ability to depict a hero who can make active choices under pressure is the key to writing a great story. It's the key. And it's not as easy to do as it sounds. And anybody who's been writing for a bit might have discovered, if you've gotten feedback on your work, that you have occasionally, or maybe more than occasionally, slipped into a pattern of storytelling that we call the passive hero problem. And it looks something like this. It looks like a hero who is not actively trying to do much. They don't seem to have much urgency about them. They don't have a goal. They may not have a clear goal for the story as a whole. They may not have much of an objective goal or motivation. These are all words that kind of mean the same thing, even in the individual scenes of your storytelling. Instead, they might just be existing in a fictional world that you're creating, and things are just happening to them. They're going about their day, and you, the storyteller, are just letting things happen. They're bumping into people. They're, having conversations. Maybe random things are happening around them, but there isn't a sense of them actually driving the narrative forward. So that's one red flag of the passive hero problem. Another might be that you have gotten the instruction from me or someone else that your hero needs a goal, and that once they start to pursue it, there will be forces of opposition, right? Obstacles will come in their way. But you haven't actually put real obstacles in the way of the hero, right? Maybe there isn't much preventing them from achieving their goal. Or maybe you've thrown some obstacles in the path of the hero, but the hero doesn't seem to react to them. They either evaporate on their own or the hero is just flummoxed and stuck in the face of them, or something else. It's not actually, we're just not getting past this fundamental equation of storytelling, which is like hero in pursuit of a goal, faces obstacles, tussle, and then there's a consequence of some kind that causes what happens next. Like, that's the core of it. It's not hard for me to rattle off, but it can be really challenging to execute, right? So we call all of this the sort of passive hero problem. And I just want to frame our discussion today about how humans, and real humans and fictional humans, react to pressure, by foregrounding the fact that it's actually quite important, right, that our hero react to pressure. It's important that we put them under pressure, and then it's important that they react to it. Because if they don't, we have a passive hero. And why is this a problem? Stories are about transformation. They are, in fact, a depiction of the transformation of consciousness of the hero, of our main character. And as we all know, people do not go through big transformations, moving outside their comfort zones, discovering their true natures and capabilities, solving their big internal blocks and problems, unless they're kind of forced to. People will stay comfortable. If they are comfortable, they will stay comfortable. So we have to put our heroes under pressure, because change happens under pressure. I would say that is, in fact, a really good description of our job as storytellers, is to keep relentlessly applying pressure to our heroes. We're not just doing it once. We are doing it scene after scene after scene. A novel is a pretty long form of storytelling, right? There's just a lot of pressure that needs to be applied. And it's not just, one giant coming down to smush our hero in the beginning. That the story's over if that happens. We need to be able to design a series of efforts and obstacles and reactions and consequences in order to get us through the storytelling that comprises an entire novel. And this is basically why I say that depicting a hero who can make active choices under pressure is the key to writing a great story. Because if you can't do that, you actually don't have much to put on the page. Now, I have worked with lots of writers over the years. I've been a teacher for a long time, in various guises, and am now so pleased to be doing it with the Path of the Storyteller community. And I can tell you that this passive hero issue comes up all the time. I mean, it's really common. And even when I point it out, which I do, my students out there know that I do point it out, it is just not that easy a thing to stop doing. It's not that easy to change. And I find this really intriguing. Like, why do writers, even when they know that they've got to come up with an active hero who, is confronted with obstacles in the face of them pursuing a goal, and they've got to do something about it, and there'll be consequences. We could say it all day long. In fact, sometimes we do, but it's not that easy to do because there's kind of a default to different types of behavior. Sometimes the heroes just kind of buckle under, and we see pages that have a lot of ruminating, right? Interior heroes just kind of having an interior experience of stress, but not actually doing anything about the obstacle in front of them. It seems simple, but I'm telling you out there, it's not. And I am very curious about it. Now, listen, I am not a psychologist. I'm going to be talking today a little bit about psychology, but obviously I'm not a psychologist. I am a novelist, however. So thinking about human motivation and transformation, and particularly how humans behave under pressure, is like really part of my job. And if you're a writer out there, which I think you are, if you're watching this, it is your job too. All right. So we're going to try to solve these two questions today. We're going to talk about how we can use this idea of how humans respond to pressure to write better plots, essentially, to be better storytellers. But I also, by the time we finish, want to maybe explore why writers find it so hard to get into the active mode with their storytelling. And I hope that if we can get some insight into that, it's going to create like big light bulbs going off and maybe really change some things for you today. So that's our goal. In my introduction, I introduced these psychological concepts. And, as I said, I'm not a psychologist, but there's a lot written about this. So if it intrigues you, you can certainly do some research. Not every article about psychology out there uses the exact same language or the exact same definition. It's a kind of a commonplace that there are 4 broad categories of human response to stress and pressure and trauma. Some people say, no, there are 5. And some people say, no, there are 6. But this seems to be quite a common framework, the 4 main categories, and that's what I'm going to use today. And the 4 main categories are fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. Kudos for whoever came up with the alliteration. As a writer, I wholeheartedly approve. So I'm just going to talk about these one at a time, just to be clear about what they mean, what the definition is. And then we're going to see how they apply to our storytelling and perhaps our own writing practices. So the first one is fight. And this one is, in a sense, easiest to understand because it kind of is what it sounds like it is. When a person, we're talking about real human people now, not our fictional people, although it applies to them as well. But when a person is confronted with a threat, a perceived danger, right? The nervous system has a reaction. And if the reaction falls in the category of fight, it's an aggressive reaction. It is, it's countering aggression with aggression or assertiveness. So this is a situation in which the person who feels threatened, who feels endangered, does something about it that's assertive, that's directed at the source of danger. They might physically defend themselves, right? They might actually get into a physical altercation. They might verbally defend themselves. So you might see verbal expressions of anger, argument, just like raised voices, people yelling at each other. Like it's not conflict avoidant. It's the person responding to a perceived threat or danger actively, assertively. It's out there where you can see it. It's in the body, it's in the voice, it's in the face. I mean, you can't mistake it if someone is responding from the category of a fight response. So it is active, it is high energy, and it seeks confrontation. It doesn't shy away from confrontation, it goes at it. So the element of power is involved, right? So someone who uses a fight-based response to a perceived threat is, feeling that they can defend themselves. They're going to try to overpower their opponent or adversary or whatever this perceived danger is. They're going to take action about it, action that we can see. All right, that's pretty clear, right? The second category of how humans respond in face of a perceived threat or danger is flight. Now, flight means to flee, and that's what this category of responses is about. So in its most essential form, it's to run away. This is danger. There's a perceived threat. I'm running away. I'm getting out of here. I'm going to back off. I'm going to leave the premises. This is not so much emotions of anger and assertiveness or aggression, but more panic, right? Emotions that have more to do with anxiety, fear, and panic would energize the flight from danger. Now, in certain circumstances, we can't actually walk away from a perceived threat. And in modern life, this is a kind of a complicated reality because we still have the same nervous systems that our long ago ancestors developed to face far more primal types of danger. In modern life, the types of threat and danger that we face could be very emotional or economic, or they could be more abstract in nature. If we are in the workplace and we feel threatened somehow or endangered somehow, or the recipient of some kind of attack, right? Even if it's subtle and based in competition, or all the different kinds of danger that we could find ourselves in, that are maybe not literal physical danger, but stuff that triggers us, that we feel we're in a hot spot. We can actually physically run away, right? We have an awareness that, I can't just run out of my job because somebody took credit for my work as much as we would like to. So I want you to also think of flight metaphorically, the kinds of things that we would do to flee something, to avoid something. When we can't physically leave, we might bury ourselves in work to flee an emotionally precarious situation in our personal lives, right? Like that's an example how somebody might run away without physically running away. They might run away mentally. They might, just be very avoidant and keep themselves very, very busy so they didn't have to deal with the thing. So that's a kind of a flight. I'm sure you can understand that. Procrastination is a kind of flight, right? We are maybe not leaving the room where our unfinished manuscript is, but we find a lot of ways to procrastinate. So in a sense, we're running from it, okay? And you're all writers. I know you can think in metaphors, right? So the flight category of response is also energetic. I mean, you're doing something to flee, even if, it's something silly and procrastinating, and you decide that now is a good time to dust the living room because there's a phone call that you don't want to make, right? There's a conversation you don't want to have. And so you come up with reasons to avoid it. So you're doing stuff. So there is some energy involved, but it is not like the fight response. The fight response is energetic and seeks confrontation, but the flight response is energetic but avoids confrontation. So those are just, making kind of broad generalizations here, but you can see there's differences between these two. The third one of our list of 4 is the freeze response. And I know that all of us can relate to this at one point or another in our lives. When the stress of some kind of threat or danger overwhelms us, it is a very normal human response to go into freeze mode, to shut down. It's a kind of a shutdown of the nervous system. And so instead of the kind of emotions of anger and assertiveness that the fight response might raise in us, instead of the emotions of panic and anxiety that the flight response might raise in us, the freeze response actually turns everything off. It creates numbness and a kind of a disassociated quality. We have phrases built into the language that describe this freeze response. It is absolutely part of the human nervous system's set of options for how we respond to serious threat. If you know the phrase, someone who's scared stiff, or if you've ever heard the phrase, frozen like a deer in the headlights, you can see that it's describing the freeze response. So this is super common. It's very real. It is a self-protective response to threat, but it is a low energy response. And in that way, it is different than fight or flight. It's sort of the opposite. It's like a shutdown, right? So it's a low energy response, and it appears passive, right? The deer in the headlights, or someone who is scared stiff, is actually rendered incapable of action. So it looks very passive on the outside. Now, what we can understand, because psychologists have done this fine work in helping us understand, is that it's not really passive. It's actually quite a profound systemic response to danger. Something is happening in the person. It's a big self-protective reflex, but it does look passive because the person is rendered incapable of action. So this is a kind of a profound way of avoiding confrontation by absolutely checking out of the situation. All right, so we see already we've got 3 very different sets of responses, different energy levels, and different relationships to the confrontation itself, the perceived danger itself. So there's one more, and this is the one that I think people are less familiar with. I find it very interesting myself. And it's called the fawn response. And that's spelled fawn like to fawn over something, or, a baby deer is also a fawn. But it's more used in the sense of somebody who is actually acting quite solicitous, who's expressing a lot of positive emotions toward the object of their fawning. Now, how is this part of the human nervous system response to threat and danger? Fascinating. This is a survival strategy. When a person who is, confronting this perceived threat or danger might respond by buttering up the source of the danger, by trying to please them, by dropping their own position and saying, right, you're absolutely right. It's a kind of a surrender, right? It's like a kind of collapse of boundaries. And in this is where the person protects themselves by sort of switching teams and says, fine, I'm just going to form an alliance with the source of danger. I'm going to try to diffuse the confrontation by saying, okay, fine, you're right. It's like there's a phrase, people pleasing, like it's kind of a people pleasing response. But it's one that erases the self, right? Because it requires the person who's using the fawn response to completely give up their own position and just kind of surrender and collapse. I've seen in some articles that I looked at in preparing for today that the fawn response can also be used sometimes as a secondary response when the fight, flight, and freeze responses don't work, right? And so that's a way to look at it. But it could also just be the response that a person comes up with when confronted. Like they could go right to it. So super interesting, right? Fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. So the fawn response also requires some energy, but it is absolutely an attempt to avoid conflict. This is a response that would rather surrender than even put up a fight, or try to run away, or or freeze. It's an active response, but it's very avoidant of conflict. Now, I want to say something before we move on to talking about how this impacts us as writers. And I also see some really interesting comments going on, and I want to bring those into the conversation as well. So, what I've just talked about is stuff that psychologists have come up with. It's interesting, sort of shorthand way of understanding some pretty complicated ideas. And these are survival instincts that are part of our human psychology and physicality, right? They are survival instincts that have evolved in us as humans have evolved. So one of them is not a better survival instinct than another. There's no hierarchy of value system. There's no judgment about any of these. When we are under stress, when we feel our survival is threatened, instincts takes over, our nervous system takes over, our bodies are flooded with hormones. I mean, there's just a physical response that happens, right? Anybody knows who's ever been under stress, which is all of us, it affects our heart rate, it affects our breathing, our pupils dilate. It's very easy to monitor physically when a person is under stress. And I want to make a point of saying this because I do know that people who have survived real trauma, it is sometimes a symptom, right, of having unresolved trauma, that the person struggles to feel okay about how they responded. And so I just really want to make this point before we go on, that when we talk about these responses psychologically, we're we're not we're not having an opinion about them. These are all normal responses that we all are capable of, that we all have experienced. We don't get to choose which one we have, right? We don't get to choose. They are what they are. So I just want to put that out there with a big hug to all of us, right, who have been through stress, trauma, and it is all of us. We have all experienced all of these types of reactions. It's not a conscious choice. Now, let's move on to fiction. So now I'm just sort of drawing a little bit of a line, because the truth is that in fiction, unlike real life, we storytellers do get to choose how our hero responds. We are both creating the stress. We're introducing the danger to their experience. That's our job as storytellers. And then we get to choose how our hero responds. All right. So now we're in the world of fiction. It is our job to keep putting our heroes again and again into the kind of situations that are going to trigger some of these responses to danger, right? Fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Now, I started this talk by saying that it was really useful for writers to start thinking in terms of active choices, having your hero be an active force in the storytelling. So now, from that viewpoint, through that lens, let's look again at fight, flight, freeze, and fawn and see what they offer us as storytellers, right? The first one, to fight, is the active response. It is an energetic response, and it seeks confrontation. So if we're looking for active responses where our hero actually gets to do something about the danger, the threat, the force of opposition or adversity that we have put in front of them, the fight response is a really useful category. Fight does not have to be physical. It can be verbal. It can be strategic. It can involve trickery, but it's just depicting a character who is able to move into confrontation and do something about the predicament that we have put them in. The flight response is also energetic, and it avoids confrontation, right? It uses that energy to avoid confrontation. So I just want you to think for a minute as a storyteller what it might mean for you to create scene after scene where your hero's trying to achieve their goal, their objective, their motivation, whatever you want to call it. We do our job and we put obstacles in their path, and then we have our hero flee the situation. Now, we've already established that, to flee, the flight reaction is a perfectly correct, normal, and accurate thing to do. But how many times do you think in a story we can really get away with our hero saying, I don't want to be in this scene, I'm running away? It's tricky, right? It's a very tricky thing. We have to think about where in the story we are. There is a stage of the hero's journey that we talk about in the Path of the Storyteller program when I teach story structure to my students, called the refusal of the call. And that is, in a sense, like a flight reaction, right? It's the hero saying, I've been presented with a big adventure of transformation. It's going to be super hard. I don't want to do it, and they might busy themselves or say, no, thank you, or come up with excuses, right? But you can think of that as a flight reaction. And that might be really useful early in your story. But once your hero is on the adventure, it's not going to be that useful to you as a storyteller to have them refusing again and again. So even though the flight reaction is real, as a storyteller, you have to be mindful of how you use it. Now, let's talk about the freeze response. Now, as I described a couple minutes ago, the freeze response is super low energy on the surface, and it appears passive on the surface. It's in a work of fiction, a hero who's confronted with an obstacle that renders them incapable of action because they are so overwhelmed by stress, is not even going to be able to be an active participant in the scene, right? But what they are going to feel is numb and disassociated and frozen and stuck. And I want to take a moment to weave in some comments that I think are pertinent. Hillary, thank you so much for posting these. I'm just going to bring up a comment from Hillary. Hillary posts, for me, one problem is keeping my hero separate from me. They get passive really fast if I use them as a peephole into the scene. That's right. That's a really interesting comment. Keeping your hero separate from you. And so Hillary also uses this term peephole, where the character, rather than being an active participant in the scene, is becoming kind of a doppelganger or an avatar, in a sense, for the writer themselves. So one of the ways that writers do what Hillary just described, wittingly or unwittingly, is that they have their hero go into a freeze response under pressure. And so all of a sudden, it's like the hero is disassociated, having that terrible experience when someone is just so overwhelmed by terror or stress that they're sort of like leave their body and are kind of floating above the scene. Now, again, in real life, this is a thing that happens, right? And I fear many of us have experienced it at one part of our lives or another, but it's a very intense response to danger. And if we use it in our storytelling, then we are, in a sense, doing what Hillary described, which is we're lifting our hero somewhat out of the scene and just using them as an observer. So even though the freeze response is psychologically accurate, and it's not something that I would say you must never depict in fiction, quite the opposite. It is psychologically accurate. If it is your go-to response to stress as a writer, you have to be mindful about the fact that you're creating a hero who is unable to act. And if they're unable to act, then the goings on of your narrative are being pushed forward by some other means. And this is very difficult to do, because if the story itself is not being driven by the need of the hero to achieve a goal and, monitoring their incremental journey of transformation, then there's no engine to the story. And what does it do? It sputters out. Anyone who's ever gotten partway into writing a novel and maybe near the end of the first act or early in the second act just felt they got stuck and there was no place else to go. You know what I mean by sputtering out. And so this could be something for you to look at, right? Have you created a hero whose go-to response to stress is to freeze? All right, and let's talk about this last one as well, the fawn response. This is another strategy that is psychologically accurate. It is a low energy response, and it, like the freeze and flee responses, it seeks to avoid confrontation. It means that the hero of your story is going to kind of give up their mission. They're going to quit. They're going to take the position of the adversary, if you will. So I wonder how this is making you feel about your works in progress. I would love to hear in the comments if you're recognizing any of these strategies in the way you've currently conceived your narrative for your hero. As you can see, of these types of responses, the fight response and the flight response are active. They have some energy to them. But of all of four, the only one that actually engages in confrontation is the fight response. And the other three, although psychologically accurate, are all about avoiding confrontation. Right? This is really interesting. The freeze response not only avoids confrontation, but renders our hero unable to act and therefore unable to push the narrative forward. And the fawn response indicates that our hero is even perhaps going to give up their mission. They're going to jump ship and sort of quit and take up whatever position the forces of opposition have decided. So it's kind of obvious, if you will, that as writers, we have to get comfortable finding the fight in our hero. We really have to find the fight in our hero. All of the ways that our hero might be capable of fighting under pressure. And why is this so tricky? So now we're kind of moving into this territory of, well, so why is it so difficult for writers to write active heroes? And why is it so common for writers to default to passive heroes? Well, I mean, one reason, obviously, is that 3 of the 4 categories of human response to threat are actually avoidant of confrontation and somewhat, fall on relative points of the passivity scale. So it's normal. I mean, it's just normal. If 3/4 of our choices are passive, if 3 out of 4 of the types of conflict responses that humans have are passive, it makes perfect sense. But writing a story, crafting a well-structured story, is not meant to be a sort of documentary footage of how people are in real life. A story is a thing that we make. It has a structure that's somewhat artificial. And the artificiality of it is, ironically, what makes it so true, because it just allows us to focus on the deep experience of being human without being kind of blanketed over with the day-to-day minutia of being human. In real life, people do not go on life-changing journeys of transformation every day, right? This is something that many people, will not take on willingly. In life, we struggle to pursue our dreams. We might spend a long time feeling stuck, right? I mean, life is filled with all kinds of struggles. But in a story, we storytellers are going to sort of distill the truth of this type of experience into something very compressed. And I often use this image with my Path of the Storyteller students. It's not a painter's job to paint the entire world. A painter says, I'm going to paint that field of flowers. I'm going to paint that person. They put a frame around it and they try to express something kind of universal and meaningful by being really, really precise and specific in what they put in the frame and what they leave out. So storytelling is the same. It has the same feeling of being a very tight frame, and everything inside the frame is composed. It's chosen for a reason, in order to create a particular impact. So we have to think about this idea of how our characters respond to stress in a different way. We can't say, well, sometimes they'll fight, and sometimes they'll freeze, and sometimes they'll flee, and sometimes they'll fawn. Yeah, sometimes they might do all those things. But most of the time, it's going to serve you best if you can find the fight in your hero. Now, why is this so hard? Well, all right, it's a little bit artificial, and so that is true. But I also want to ask you all to ponder in your own life when you are confronted with stress. How difficult is it for you to find the fight in yourself? Are you, as I think most of us would be, more prone to fleeing in some way, whether it's physically fleeing or mentally fleeing or emotionally fleeing or keeping yourself busy or procrastinating, or your first response to pressure or stress is maybe not necessarily to meet it head on. We all do this. Is your response to freeze? Is that something that happens to you easily? And for some people it does. Some people can freeze up and become kind of immobilized fairly easily in life, and a lot of this depends on what our histories, what we've been through in our lives, our temperaments, and all the rest. Is that a much easier response for you to access with a freeze response? Were you at some point in your life taught or raised to be flexible to the point where as soon as someone offers a conflicting viewpoint, you say, fine, we'll do it your way? The phrase people pleaser, I think I used before. Is that something that you fall into very easily, sincerely or not, by the way? Sometimes this people pleasing can be kind of a strategy. Like, okay, fine, we'll do it your way. It might not be how you really feel, but the price of conflict is somehow too high to pay for whatever reason. You really don't want the conflict. And so you're willing to agree to give up your position, to just end the argument by fawning, right? By just saying, okay, I capitulate. You're right. We'll do it your way. So if that is something that's really easy for you to access, I want you to think about that as well. You are going to go through your experience writing your story in this kind of artificial pose of having to invent obstacle after obstacle after obstacle, and then having to invent how your hero reacts time and time and time and time again. And so if you are more comfortable reaching for a flight response, a freeze response, or a fawn response, if that's just what feels more believable to you, more authentic to you, your storytelling might get chock full of these essentially passive responses that don't really allow the hero to move the story forward. I'm not saying never use them, because they are psychologically accurate, but you have to find the fight in your hero in order to have them go on the journey of transformation that we actually set out to do, right? So I want you to get fluent with the fight response. I really want you to think about it. I don't want you to have your hero flee in key moments of the plot. I don't want you to have them freeze up in key moments of the story. There may be moments when your hero is truly overwhelmed, but if they are immobilized for any length of time, you're going to be stuck, because who's moving the story forward? Whose story did it just become? One of the red flags of this kind of thing is a narrative where there might be one or more sidekick or secondary characters that the writer has to keep sort of dragging in to move the plot forward. And they have to do that because they keep putting their hero in a kind of a freeze response or a flight response. They keep taking their hero out of the fight. And so the story can't move forward unless somebody is willing to move it forward. And so this is when we see these sort of secondary characters become far more engaging and interesting than our hero. And the fawn response is also like potentially a useful strategy for a hero who might be using it, you know, as a way to outwit the adversary. They might pretend to switch teams. They might be charming and amenable to get information, right? I mean, the ability to fake the fawn response could be a very strategic skill for your hero. This is a kind of archetypal energy that we call shapeshifter energy. It's when a character is not who they appear to be. And our hero is certainly allowed to partake of all the archetypal energies that make a story fun. And a hero who's capable of putting on a bit of shapeshifter in order to what? To pursue their goals, to escape from a predicament. Like that's great. We love moments like that. But that is different than a true fawn response, right? A true fawn response is a character who kind of abandons their own cause as a way of avoiding conflict and getting out of danger. So you might want to play with if your instinct is to put a fawn response in, you might want to play with the ways in which it might be. Well, maybe it's shapeshifter. Maybe my hero is being clever and is going to fool the adversary in some way by pretending to be this way. The other thing that I want to mention before we conclude and look at some of these great comments that are coming in is just a reminder to also, as you evaluate which of these categories of responses is going to serve you best and why, if your hero is not having a fight response, like why that is, I always want you to examine, is there a way that my hero could actively respond to this obstacle? I want you to think about where in the story you are, because one of the things that we're depicting is transformation. And our hero in the beginning of the story might not be as able to access the fight in them as they are later. It is possible that that is true. It's not necessary that it's true. And I'm just going to bring up a comment from Nancy that is about this very issue. I just noticed this, Nancy. Nancy comments, I think I've been confusing the transformation of the hero with a change from being passive to being active in a way. Very interesting, Nancy. Now, it's certainly possible that a hero's journey of transformation could be that, could include some of that. I think there are stories that trace that kind of like an empowerment journey, right? A journey from being less empowered to more empowered. But that's not what story structure is. And a journey of transformation does not have to include that. It does not have to include that. Some of the favorite examples that we like to talk about here, because there's some of my favorite stories and the ones I know well. I mean, let's look at Ebenezer Scrooge. He's not passive. He's not passive in the beginning of his tale. He's assertively a miser. He's aggressively a miser. He's extremely active at being a miser. It's a different kind of transformation that he needs. When we meet Bilbo Baggins, he's not passive. He's assertively polishing his silver. He's keeping his house very tidy. He's entertaining visitors, with aplomb. He's very actively being who he is at the beginning of that book. What we soon learn, though, is that who he's being is not all he could be. And therefore, a journey of deep transformation is necessary in order to bring Bilbo to, the fulfillment of his potential. So there are other ways to think of this, right, than moving from passive to active. And the truth is that a character who is trapped in passivity at the beginning of a story is just going to have a really hard time getting going. And the beginning of a story requires so much of a hero. It really does. So I love your comment, Nancy, and maybe that's a bit of a light bulb for you today, right? To think about how that might not be the core of it. Yes, your hero might become better at fighting in all of the meanings of that word, fighting. They might become better at it as your story goes on. They might develop more confidence. They might step into leadership roles, right? But that's not synonymous with story structure or an arc of transformation. So maybe there's more to explore there for you. So yes, so to finish my point, consider where you are in the story. Who your hero is and how they react to pressure is going to be different at the beginning, different in the middle, different at the end. And in fact, it's by tracing the evolution of how they respond that we communicate to the reader this incremental journey of transformation. I know I've said this before, and you know it to be true because you all have read books like this and probably were frustrated by them. A story in which the hero doesn't seem to change at all for 350 pages, and they're still the same kind of whiny, passive character that they are on page 349 that they were on page 1, and then on page 350 they have some kind of epiphany, and now they're different. Nobody believes that because that's not how change happens. It's not earned. We actually want to see the process of change. That's why these obstacles are so important. That's why we have to keep serving up obstacle in face of the hero's active attempt to achieve their mission. We put the obstacle in front of them, and then if we continue to find the fight in our hero is going to do something about it. There's so many things that you can do, right, that are going to fall under the category of your hero doing something about it. Yes, there will be times that they're overwhelmed. Yes, there will be times that their attempt to overcome a big problem will fail, and then they'll be in worse straits than before, and they'll have to even find more fight within themselves to get out of it, right? The story is going to oscillate in all these great dynamic ways, but we can't leave our hero out of the fight for very long, or the story is just going to shut down. All right. So I want you to be intentional. You can use all of these ideas, but incline toward action. Find the fight in your hero. And if that means you might have to find the fight in yourself a little bit, I'm all in favor of that. I'm all in favor of that. And you've got to do it scene after scene. I am really interested in your responses now. So let me go back to some of these great comments. I'm going to bring up another comment from Hillary. Hillary says, I also tend to resort to symptom lists when trying to describe reactions like fight or freeze in drafts. Now, this is a great comment, Hillary, and I know that a lot of people are going to really relate to this. I'm so grateful that you posted this. So Hillary says that she resorts to symptoms. Now, why might we do this? And many writers do this. It's because the body has this reaction to stress. So if we put obstacles in front of our hero, which we do, what's going to happen? Their heart rate is going to increase. Their breathing is going to change. Their pupils are going to dilate. Like their skin's going to get cold and clammy. This is what happens to the body under stress. How many times can we use those descriptions to indicate that the hero is under stress? That's a given. That the body does those things under stress is kind of a given. Do they move the story forward? They do not. They do not. And so we have to be judicious in the use of this type of description. And we must never let using this list of symptoms, as Hillary describes it, substitute for actually having our hero react. And this is one of the times when I think that as writers, we might incline toward the freeze response and think we've had the hero react to the obstacle when we haven't. The hero's trying to do something, an obstacle or force of opposition presents itself, which it should. And then we describe the hero's symptoms. They are reacting physically to the elevation of the stress. But then we don't have them do anything because we feel, no, we've just had 2 paragraphs of their heart rate, their breathing, their blood pressure, their pulse, their pupils, their skin tingling, right? Like all of this stuff that does in fact happen. And that we let that be their reaction, but they haven't done anything. So that is in a sense settling for the freeze response. We just enter into the hero's like frozen state and all they can experience is what's going on inside their body. Meantime, there's a scene going on. Some obstacle has been presented. Someone has thrown down the gauntlet to them. They've got to do something about it. That's when the scene can move forward. Okay. So this is a really great thing to be aware of. Thanks so much for Hillary to bring that up. A little bit of that kind of description goes a long way because it's just, in a sense, cliche. It's just familiar. We all have the same experiences under stress. But what's your hero going to do about it? So spend more time thinking about what the hero is going to do than the changes in their breathing and heart rate. It's not as interesting, and it's certainly not useful for moving the story forward. Constanza leaves a comment that's quite akin, in a sense, to what Nancy's point was. I'm so glad you posted this, Constanza. Constanza says, isn't it so that heroes of stories need some time until they start fighting? First they flee or freeze, but then. So this is very much right along the lines of what Nancy was saying. Imagining a hero at the beginning of a story really kind of being locked into more passive responses. But, as I said, Constanza, in using my Ebenezer Scrooge and Bilbo Baggins examples, it's not so. We can have a hero who starts out quite assertive, quite able to be the person that they are at the beginning of the story, right? Being in a shut down, disenfranchised state, like being in a sense stuck in freeze mode, if you will, is not necessarily the beginning of a story. And I'm trying to think of an example. If we can go to our Wizard of Oz examples that we all enjoy. So in the film of the Wizard of Oz, we meet Dorothy, who's a girl with a dog on a farm, and nobody has time to deal with her. And she's lonely, but she tries to get people to deal with her. She tries to get people's attention. She wants it. Because she's a kid, she doesn't have the power to make people do what she wants them to do, but she makes attempts to get the attention that she wants. She does. She's not passive about it. And, and she's in a sense in a powerless condition at the beginning. I think this is a really useful learning moment. And I'm learning something from you as well, that this idea of being passive as a way to kick off a story is an idea that some writers hold. A couple of you have raised it now. I'm going to think about this more, but for the moment, I really want to tell you, encourage yourselves to unpack that. What if that were not so? What if your hero was whoever they were at the beginning of the story, and that they were actively being that person, but that person was not who they needed to end up being? I want you to consider that. Really want you to consider that, because if we start a novel with a passive hero, how is the reader going to say, I'll just keep reading this passive hero for the first, 20 or 30 pages because I'm hoping that they become more interesting on page 40? It's actually the opposite, of how we want to begin a story. Even a children's book like Charlotte's Web begins with a little girl in absolute fight mode. On page 1, she will do anything to save the little runt pig that is in danger. And so passivity is not a requirement of the beginnings of stories. Let's talk more about that one. I'm really interested in this belief that's come up now. We've got a few more comments, and I'm going to bring up one from Anne. Anne asks, do you think it works in fiction to have a couple of stages of response at times? Maybe an initial response of fight or flight, and then collect themselves and take a more thoughtful course. Just as in life, and this is something that could happen in fiction, right? Just as in life, I would, the only thing about what you're asking that I would encourage you to consider is the idea that a hero could have one reaction to a scene and then later collect themselves and have a more thoughtful course. We have this idea of a story moving forward almost like a line of dominoes, where each scene is causing the next thing to happen. And so what you would need to think about, if this was something you wanted to depict in your hero's development, their ability to say, I didn't react well, and I'd like to take a different, more intentional, mindful reaction to something that happened, is you don't want to circle, right? You don't want to keep going back and circling and saying, well, we're going to re-explore a scene that already happened. You can only move forward, in a sense. So if your hero approaches an obstacle and has a bad response, let's say one that doesn't work, um, then the consequence of that scene is whatever the consequence is to their initial way of coping. So it will have a consequence. It will be a complete scene on its own. And then later, your hero can try again. And then that will be a new scene with a new consequence. I just don't want you to think that that you can, sort of effectively loop around a scene and redo it in that way. You want them to have to deal with the consequence and then take another whack at it. I hope that's clear. And I'm going to bring up another comment from you, Anne, and I think we'll wrap up after this. So Anne says, as a person who can tend to have a lot of fight, spunky Anne, I love it. I have to think about how to best channel that energy, though I don't know that I tend to write heroes that way. So if you think of yourself, Anne, as being a person who has a lot of fight, then you can, exploit that expertise in your storytelling. And you might be able to find the fight in your hero more easily than a person who has trouble accessing that energy in real life. So that's something for you to explore. That is something for you to explore. Although you do say you don't know that you tend to write heroes that way, and that is also something to explore, right? If in life you lean into confrontation and you're good with that, but then you write heroes who avoid confrontation. So many questions. As ever, everyone, thank you so much for being here, for this really nice participation, thoughtful comments. You just sort of brought this conversation even further than I anticipated it going, and I'm really grateful for that. As always, when we explore story structure, we are exploring the truth of being human, and we end up exploring the truth of being ourselves. And this is a great thing, because writing from a place of emotional authenticity is something that makes our work worth more to the reader. It's what our reader comes to us for, right? And they will be satisfied when we really tell the truth about what it feels like to be human. They will respond very positively. Much gratitude to everybody. Thank you so much. If you are here for the first time and you're not subscribed to this YouTube channel, I hope you will subscribe. If this content interested you, give it a thumbs up. It's super helpful to me, and I really appreciate it. I am here most Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Pacific time talking about something like this that has to do with story structure, writing craft, or the mindset of the working writer. So I hope you'll be back, and feel free to enjoy all of the content on this YouTube channel. There's a lot there to go through. If you're looking for something to help your own writing practice get a little bit of a boost, why not download the free writing prompts that I talked about earlier? I think that you will find a lot of inspiration in them. And as you go through those writing prompts, you too can make it a little practice. Write a Post-it note, find the fight in your hero. What are they going to do about it? So interesting. I am grateful for you all, and I will see you next week. And until then, happy writing, everyone.